Neil Ratner Rock Doc here with a story. Yesterday, I posted about Janis Joplin on what would have been her 75th birthday. And today, I thought I would talk a little bit more about arguably one of the greatest rock and roll artists of all time. Okay. Now, I never got to meet Janis, although I did see her perform a few times, and I did know some people who knew her. And one of those was my old friend Bobby Ramirez, the drummer from Edgar Winter's White Trash. Now, both Bobby and Janis grew up in the gritty oil town of Port Arthur, Texas. And although Bobby was a few years younger, he remembered her very well from those early days at Thomas Jefferson High School in Port Arthur. Now, Janis was short, fat, and had a bad case of teenage acne, which made her an easy target for all the high school bullies. Now, luckily for Janis, she was into painting back then, and there was a group of teenage boys who found her interesting enough to let her hang out with them. Now, it was basically through one of these guys who gave her a Leadbelly record that Janis got turned on to the blues. And she started to listen to more blues and more blues. And eventually, she began singing in a folk group. But according to Bobby, she couldn't wait to leave Port Arthur, and she left as soon as she could. Now, the first time I saw her perform was with Big Brother and the Holding Company during the winter of 1968. I was a student at the University of Vermont, and Janis and Big Brother were the headliners for our winter weekend. Now, up until that point, Big Brother had only played the West Coast. And although they were starting to get known from an unbelievable performance at the Monterey Pop Festival, they weren't that well known in the East Coast yet. But then they signed with manager Albert Grossman up here in Bearsville, which is right next to Woodstock. Now, Grossman also managed Dylan, the band, Van Morrison, and a few other artists. And he immediately sent Janis and Big Brother on their first East Coast tour, which included their New York debut, not at the Fillmore, but at the Anderson Theater. I think it was on 2nd Avenue and like 4th Street or something in the East Village of New York City in February of '68. And the show that I saw was on the tour in Vermont, and they ended the tour on April 7th, 1968, when they performed with Jimi Hendrix, Buddy Guy, Joni Mitchell, Richie Havens, Paul Butterfield, and Elvin Bishop at the Wake for Martin Luther King Jr. concert at the Fillmore East in New York City. Now, after the concert at the University of Vermont, in typical Janis fashion, she met some locals and they went to a dive bar in the poorest section of town to trade shots of Southern comfort. Now, of course, by the time I heard about it hours later, she was long gone. And like I said, I never got a chance to meet her. Let's listen to a little Janis. Just a little bit harder. So I can love me. Okay, now, the only other time I saw Janis perform was at Woodstock with the Cosmic Blues Band. Now, although Janis was billed as a headliner, she didn't even know anything about the festival until a few days before the event, and friends had to convince her that it would be a good thing to do. So, Janis got upstate. She was picked up by the helicopter from the hotel near the site where all the bands were staying. Her friend Joan Baez and Joan's mother were also in the helicopter. And according to Baez, when Janis saw the size of the crowd, she got nervous and freaked out. But after settling in backstage, she calmed down and became excited about playing. But as fate would have it, delay after delay kept pushing Janis's performance back. And faced with a 10-hour delay, Janis began to drink and shoot heroin. And by the time she went on stage, she was very stoned and drunk. But Joplin was a true professional and pulled it off, though her voice cracked a bit here and there. Now, Pete Townsend from The Who was backstage and watched her performance, and he had this to say. She had been amazing at Monterey, but tonight she wasn't at her best, due probably to the long delay and probably, too, to the amount of booze and heroin she consumed while she waited. But even Janis on an off night was incredible. And on a personal note, I admit she wasn't nearly as good as when I had seen her the year before, but she was Janis Joplin in all her glory, and that was enough for me. Janis wasn't thrilled with her performance either, but loved the festival and stayed around till the very end. There are pictures out there of her with Grace Slick, and she was among the many Woodstock performers who stood in a circle behind Crosby, Stills, and Nash during their performance. And she sat in Joe Cocker's van and watched Hendrix close the show. A little over a year later, she was dead. A tremendous loss. But at least we still have her music. Hey, that's my story. I hope you liked it. Neil Ratner Rock Doc. Have a great day and join me tomorrow for another story. Yeah. Bye now.